Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're taking a good close look at the doctrine of the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation in the Olivet Discourse. Pardon me. Now, I want to call attention to the fact that it's absolutely amazing to me. I must confess, I am astounded. The very first time I read it, I thought, surely they're not serious. I was reading Greg Beale, and for those of you who want the specific page number in the book and all that kind of stuff, just contact me and I'll be glad to give you the reference. But Greg Beale, in discussing the Great Tribulation, says the Great Tribulation began in the first century and has been going on ever since and will continue until the end of time. And I'm going, what? And by the way, at least one former preterist that I'm aware of now takes that same position. I'm sorry. This is such a strange idea. Now, maybe I haven't read enough, okay? I like to think that I read a lot. You ought to see my desk right now and all the books I have on top of it. Yes, I've been reading them. I either have or am reading them, or I will read them. But in all of my years of reading and all of the various literature that I have read, reading Greg Beale's comments that the Great Tribulation began in the first century and continues to this day and continues until the end of time. You know, Kim Riddlebarger kind of hints at that, by the way. But I had never seen anyone overtly state it. And then when on Facebook, this former preterist took the same position, I was just, holy cow, how can anyone take such a position? Now, the argument is made by the former preterist, well, you can't make the argument that the Great Tribulation is all that bad because, after all, that's hyperbolic language. Now, I've shared that with you, okay, earlier this week. How this language, nothing like it before, nothing like it ever since, doesn't necessarily mean it's the worst thing that the world has ever seen. Now, I'm going to have something to say about the covenantal significance of AD 70 here in another video. So the argument is made that, well, the Great Tribulation began in the first century and continues to this day and will continue until the end of time because you can't make the argument that there's never been anything like it before or ever will be again. Literally. Well, in the first place, there has to be some kind of validity to the language. There has to be a kernel of truth to the language that we can apply. But contextually, all right, contextually, when we look at Matthew chapter 24, what Jesus said about the abomination and the ensuing tribulation absolutely rules out any, quote, universal application to the Great Tribulation. Now, let me point out that my dispensational friends say that the Great Tribulation is the time, and they base this on the book of Revelation, in which 3/5 of the world's population will be slain. You catch the power of that? I heard a dispensational minister in Florida some years ago say, commenting on Revelation chapter 14, blood will be up to the horses' bridles. The 144 million soldier army will be destroyed by Jesus. And you know what he said? Jesus will himself personally stomp the blood from their bodies. And you know what he then said? I was flabbergasted. My friend John Anderson and I were sitting side by side listening to him. And this minister said, and you know what the great thing about that is? He said, I get to watch. It's a great thing to think about Jesus literally physically stomping the blood out of 144 million men. That's good news? Really? It's staggering and troubling to hear such a thing. But to continue, in Matthew chapter 24, and by the way, the obvious application here is that Jesus located, he posited the abomination and the tribulation in Judea. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then flee, for then shall be great tribulation. Then, abomination of desolation, Judea. Flee Judea, for then, when the abomination takes place, then shall be great tribulation. Not a word about the great tribulation applying to America or Russia or China or South America or whoever. And so when Greg Beale and a former preterist jump up and say, well, the great tribulation's been going on ever since, how do you get the great tribulation outside of Judea? Secondly, how do you get it applying to non-covenantal people? As yesterday's video demonstrated. The Great Tribulation has nothing to do with pagan nations being judged by Yahweh. It is Israel's story. Now, somebody may jump up and say, well, that's not like Israel only. No, it's not Israel only, except in this regard. It had to do with Israel's covenant violation, and the covenantal judgment on Israel. But guess what? That great tribulation would lead to the destruction of the old world to create the new world in which all men are called to the salvation of Christ. In a sense, the great tribulation is Israel only, yeah. But in the ultimate soteriological sense, it would be to destroy the old covenant creation to bring in the new covenant creation for all men. But to continue, very quickly, I want you to see how the constituent elements of Matthew chapter 24 rules out the Great Tribulation being a worldwide judgment on the world or the nations. Number one, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, standing where it ought not, then let those who are in Judea flee. Look, folks, if the Great Tribulation was to be something coming on the globe, then getting out of Judea would not help, right? No, the abomination would appear in Judea, and it would be then and there that the tribulation would ensue on them. That's carried out. Notice when he says, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, there's sanctuary in the mountains. There's sanctuary in Pella. That means the Great Tribulation is not in Pella. Let those who are on the housetops not come down to take anything out of his house. Now, do you realize that Jesus is using the imagery of his day and his time? You see, in Jesus' day, they built their houses right next to one another, butted up against one another. This man's wall is this man's wall, and on and on. And they would travel from house to house. And they would very often build those houses right up to the interior wall of the city. They would have steps leading up to the wall so that they could get on the wall and then descend out and escape from the This is Jesus's, what the German scholars would call the Setz in Leben, their life situation. It was their life situation. Let me ask you something. How effective of paranesis, of an exhortation, do you suppose this is in our modern day? You know, my closest neighbors are 100 yards away. Let not those who are on the housetop come down to get his goods. Well, number one, the chances are pretty slim that I'm going to be on my rooftop. Number two, it would be kind of tough to flee since I'm on a rooftop and the closest rooftop is 100 yards away. And you know what? Even in condominiums, this application doesn't work. You see, folks, the modern concept, the dispensational concept especially, of the Great Tribulation rips this passage out of any kind of historical context. Next, we'll skip down to verse 9. Woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. You know what? You could always get in a minivan and flee, even if the wife is pregnant, even if the wife is nursing. But this imagery is taken from a time in which pregnancy and nursing was a tremendous burden. And then, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. You know what? We live in a day and a time in which wintertime barely slows people down, right? But in ancient times, that was different. Secondly, well, I tell you what, let's do. We'll hold this off until tomorrow, Thursday, because I want to discuss this aspect. But I think you can see right here that there are certain elements from Jesus' discourse that actually certainly cannot properly apply to modern day. They do not apply to the world, and to apply it to the world ignores the covenantal nature of the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation, and that's a violation of the context. Hey, do not forget, introducing my brand new book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ. Have you ordered yours yet? You really need to get a copy of this book. You will be absolutely stunned. You're going to see what the scholars have to say that leads directly to the idea of spiritual resurrection. And yet they never connect the dots. But the dots are there, and they're that big. We just have to connect those dots if we have the mind to do so. Okay? Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I will see you on the flip side.